It was October of 1944, a crisp autumn evening on American soil, far removed from the shattered landscapes of Europe. For the young men of the Wehrmacht, captured on battlefields that had become synonymous with despair, their journey across the Atlantic had been a descent into a world they had been taught to despise. They arrived, a silent, weary contingent, deposited into the confines of a prisoner of war camp. Their expectations had been meticulously crafted by years of relentless indoctrination. A land of soulless industry, decadent jazz, and a populace softened by materialism, devoid of the martial spirit they believed was their own nation's sole possession. They anticipated a harsh utilitarian existence, a continuation of the grim realities of total war, perhaps even a subtle reflection of the brutality they had inflicted. Their minds were fortified against an enemy they knew only through the distorted lens of Goebbels's broadcasts, a faceless, ruthless machine. Among them was a young corporal, barely past 20, whose uniform, though now soiled and torn, still carried the faint scent of the Eastern Front's frozen earth. He had fought through the relentless snows, seen comrades fall in desperate defenses, and held firm to the conviction of his nation's righteous cause, believing in the inherent superiority of their ideology. His name, like so many others, was now merely a number in a foreign ledger. As he stood with his fellow prisoners, the barbed wire a stark, metallic demarcation between their present and a world they could not comprehend, the air carried a strange, sweet scent, mingled with the dry rustle of fallen leaves. Beyond the fences, not far from the camp's periphery, lay a suburban street, bathed in the soft, yellow glow of distant streetlights. Then, the first crack in their carefully constructed worldview appeared. A sound, at first indistinct, grew into a chorus of high-pitched laughter and excited chatter. Through the wire, past the watchful eyes of the American guards, they saw them. Children. Not the gaunt, silent figures who haunted their own bombed-out cities, not the solemn faces huddled in air raid shelters, but vibrant, noisy children. They moved like small, joyous spirits through the twilight, their forms strangely altered. Some were cloaked in black, pointed hats atop their heads. Others resembled miniature ghosts, sheets draped over their small frames. There were fantastical creatures, painted faces, and tiny devils, all clutching sacks that swelled with an almost unbelievable bounty. This was Halloween. The word itself meant nothing to them. It was a spectacle utterly alien, a scene of carefree revelry unfolding amidst a global conflict. They watched, transfixed, as these American children, oblivious to the distant screams of war, ran from door to door, their calls of trick or treat echoing faintly. Each house, it seemed, offered yet more sweets, more small treasures, into their overflowing bags. For men who had witnessed their own cities reduced to rubble, whose families faced starvation and constant aerial bombardment, whose own children had long forgotten the simple joys of public celebration, this sight was bewildering. It was an unsettling normalcy, a stark, almost perverse contrast to the grim reality of air raid sirens and rationed existence that defined their homeland. The corporal, his face still etched with the weariness of battle, felt a strange, cold sensation in his stomach, a feeling not of fear, but of profound disorientation. This was not the America they had been promised. This was something else entirely, something unsettlingly abundant and alive. The propaganda had painted a picture of a society decadent and weak, certainly, but not one capable of such vibrant, innocent celebration while the world burned. The very air here felt different, thick with an almost palpable sense of peace that was utterly foreign to their recent memories. The corporal, still reeling from the spectral vision of the children, carried the image into the stark barracks. The initial shock of the Halloween celebration slowly gave way to a deeper, more insidious form of bewilderment in the days that followed. The propaganda had promised a nation on the brink of collapse, its people weak and starving, its industry crippled. Yet here, behind the wire, the reality was a quiet, almost insulting abundance. Each morning, the mess hall, surprisingly clean and well lit, offered substantial portions of food. There was fresh bread, real coffee, and even eggs, items that had become luxuries, even mythical, in the Germany they had left behind. He remembered the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion on the Eastern Front, the thin gruel, the ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Here, the plates were full, and though the food was simple, it was plentiful, served without fanfare by American personnel who seemed neither hostile nor particularly friendly, merely efficient. He observed the other prisoners. Many, like him, ate in silence, their eyes betraying a mixture of suspicion and a primal gratitude. An older sergeant named Klaus, who had seen action in North Africa and Russia, often sat across from him. Klaus was a man whose cynicism had been honed by years of war, a quiet observer whose gaze seemed to pierce through the surface of things. "They feed us well," Klaus had murmured one evening, his voice low. "Too well, perhaps. What do they want from us?" The corporal had no answer, only a growing knot in his stomach that was not hunger, but a burgeoning doubt. He had expected deprivation, a constant reminder of their defeat. Instead, he found a bizarre, unsettling hospitality that chipped away at the foundations of his ingrained beliefs. The camp itself, while certainly a prison, lacked the oppressive bleakness he had anticipated. The barracks, though Spartan, were heated, and the cots, though hard, were clean. There was even a small recreation area where, surprisingly, American newspapers and magazines were occasionally left. The corporal, with his rudimentary English, would pore over the photographs, trying to decipher the headlines. He saw images of American cities, bustling and intact, their skylines untouched by bombs. He saw advertisements for consumer goods, cars, refrigerators, radios, items that felt like relics from another age, or perhaps from a world that had never known war. The sheer scale of it, implied rather than explicitly stated, began to press in on him. This was not a nation struggling, but one thriving, producing, consuming, even while engaged in a global conflict. The contrast with the constant appeals for sacrifice and austerity in his homeland was stark, almost unbearable. One afternoon, during a supervised outdoor exercise, a small group of them were tasked with clearing brush near the camp's perimeter. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. An American guard, a young man with an open, unsmiling face, supervised them. He was quiet, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. At one point, as the corporal struggled with a particularly stubborn root, the guard, without a word, bent down and offered a small, worn leather glove, indicating he should use it to protect his hands. It was a gesture so small, so utterly devoid of malice or superiority, that it caught the corporal completely off guard. He had expected contempt, perhaps even cruelty, but certainly not this quiet, unassuming act of consideration. He took the glove, his fingers brushing against the soft, worn leather, and felt a strange warmth spread through him, a feeling entirely at odds with the cold certainty he had carried for so long. It was not a grand act of mercy, but a simple human kindness that transcended the barbed wire and the uniforms, a momentary bridge across the chasm of ideology. Later that week, a small, battered radio appeared in the recreation room, seemingly left by the guards. At first, the prisoners ignored it, suspicious of its purpose. But eventually, someone dared to switch it on. Static gave way to music, a melody unlike the martial anthems or classical pieces they were accustomed to. It was something rhythmic, almost mournful, yet undeniably captivating. Jazz, he realized, the decadent music his own regime had condemned. He listened, fascinated as the saxophone wailed and the drums kept a steady, insistent beat. It was the sound of a different world, a world that pulsed with an energy and a freedom he had only ever heard demonized. This was not the music of a dying civilization, but of one vibrantly, perhaps even defiantly, alive. The sheer normalcy of these experiences, the plentiful food, the untouched cities glimpsed in newspapers, the small act of kindness, the forbidden music, began to accumulate, each one a tiny chisel against the solid rock of his indoctrination. The enemy, it seemed, was not the monolithic, soulless entity he had been taught to despise, but a complex, living society, capable of both immense power and surprising, understated humanity. The corporal found himself staring at his reflection in the barrack window, a face he barely recognized, trying to reconcile the soldier he was with the man who was beginning to see. Osdias blurred into weeks, each one a subtle erosion of the foundations of his youth. The corporal, whose name was indeed Gunther, though it rarely passed anyone's lips now, found himself increasingly detached from the rigid certainties that had once defined his very being. The image of the laughing children, the taste of real coffee, the unexpected touch of a leather glove, the mournful wail of a saxophone, these fragments coalesced into a mosaic that bore no resemblance to the enemy he had been conditioned to despise. He began to carry a small, worn, leather-bound diary, a relic from his pre-war life, its pages mostly blank until now. In the quiet solitude of his cot, beneath the dim, flickering barrack lights, He would write not of battle, but of observation. His German script, usually firm and decisive, became hesitant, grappling with new, unsettling truths. He noted the precise number of eggs served at breakfast, the unexpected thickness of the blankets, the sheer, unhurried scale of the American landscape visible beyond the wire, vast fields stretching into an indifferent horizon, untouched by the scars of artillery. He remembered the endless speeches, the fervent declarations of America's impending collapse, its racial divisions tearing it apart, its industrial might a mere illusion propped up by Jewish financiers. Yet, what he saw, even from within the confines of his prison, contradicted every word. He saw the trains passing in the distance, long, heavy lines of freight cars laden with materials, moving with an almost arrogant efficiency. He overheard snippets of conversation from the guards, casual mentions of production quotas, of factories churning out planes and tanks at a pace that seemed impossible. It wasn't the image of a nation teetering on the edge, but of an unstoppable, self-renewing force, its internal engine humming with a power that dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. The propaganda had not merely exaggerated, it had outright lied, constructing an elaborate fiction to justify a war against an enemy whose true strength and character had been deliberately obscured. One evening, as a chill wind swept through the barracks, carrying the scent of burning leaves, Klaus, the older sergeant, sat down beside him. Klaus was cleaning a pair of spectacles, his movements slow and deliberate. "They have so much," Klaus said, his voice a low rumble, almost to himself. "We were told they were soft, spoiled, yet look around. Even here, in a prison, there is more than many of our own have at home." Gunther merely nodded, his gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floor. He wanted to argue, to defend the ideology that had given his life meaning, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That the deprivation in Germany was a noble sacrifice, a temporary hardship. The thought felt hollow, even cruel, now that he had witnessed this alien abundance. He remembered his mother's letters, thin and fragile, speaking of endless queues for meager rations, of the pervasive damp cold in their apartment, of the constant drone of air raid sirens. He had dismissed these details as temporary, a necessary evil on the path to victory. Now, they felt like a betrayal. The camp library, a modest collection of donated books and magazines, became a sanctuary for Gunther. He found an old atlas, its pages yellowed and brittle. He traced the vast expanse of the United States with his finger, the sheer distances, the untamed wilderness, the sprawling cities. He compared it to the cramped, ancient map of Europe etched in his memory, a continent scarred and fragmented by centuries of conflict. The scale of this new world was overwhelming, humbling. He read articles about farming techniques, about vast tracts of land dedicated to single crops, about agricultural output measured in millions of tons. It was a world of plenty, of resources seemingly without end, a stark contrast to the Malthusian anxieties that had subtly underpinned his nation's expansionist rhetoric. His teachers had spoken of Lebensraum, of the necessity to expand, to seize land and resources from lesser peoples. But here, there was simply room, an almost unimaginable excess of it, and a bounty that seemed effortlessly generated. He started to observe the American guards more closely, not as faceless symbols of the enemy, but as individuals. He saw them laugh amongst themselves, share cigarettes, sometimes even hum along to the radio. They were not the caricatures of ruthless oppressors or decadent weaklings he had been led to believe. They were young men, much like himself, albeit with cleaner uniforms and the easy confidence of those who had never known invasion. One day a young guard, no older than Gunther, dropped a photograph near the fence during a patrol. Gunther picked it up, expecting a stern reprimand. Instead, the guard, with a slight, almost embarrassed smile, simply extended his hand, retrieved the photo, and nodded a silent "thank you." It was a picture of a smiling young woman, her arm around a small child, a family. This small, mundane interaction was another pinprick in the fabric of his indoctrination. The enemy had faces, families, ordinary lives just like his own. The profound gulf of ideology began to feel less like an unbridgeable chasm and more like an artificial wall, painstakingly constructed by unseen hands. His internal landscape, once a fortress of unwavering conviction, was now a crumbling ruin. The certainty of his youth, the fierce pride in his uniform, the unwavering belief in his nation's destiny, all were dissolving, replaced by a profound, almost paralyzing sense of bewilderment. He began to question everything: the sacrifices, the suffering, the very purpose of the war. Was it all for naught, built upon a foundation of lies? The melancholic jazz music that occasionally drifted from the radio now seemed to speak to his own internal turmoil, a lament for lost innocence, for a world that was not what he had been told it was. He would often find himself gazing beyond the wire at dusk, watching the distant lights of the suburban homes flicker on, each one a tiny beacon of a reality he was only just beginning to comprehend, a reality that threatened to shatter his entire worldview. The silence that followed these reflections was not empty, but heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Questions that had no easy answers. Questions that whispered of a past he could no longer fully believe in, and a future he could not yet imagine. Gunther's diary entries became more frequent, his handwriting increasingly agitated. He meticulously recorded details that would have once seemed trivial: the precise number of loaves of bread delivered to the mess hall each day, the weight of the meat portions, the endless, seemingly effortless supply of coal for the barracks stoves. These mundane statistics, devoid of heroism or sacrifice, spoke a language far more devastating than any battlefield report. He remembered the desperate pleas for scrap metal, the rationing of every conceivable commodity back home, the constant exhortations to endure hardship for the greater good. Here, waste seemed almost inherent in the system. Half-eaten plates, discarded packaging, the sheer volume of goods that moved through this nation without apparent strain. It was a prosperity so vast, so deeply ingrained, that it felt almost offensive to eyes accustomed to scarcity. He often discussed these observations in hushed tones with Klaus. The older sergeant, ever the pragmatist, offered no easy answers. "They don't know what it is to truly go without," Klaus had observed one crisp morning, watching a delivery truck unload crates of fresh produce. "They speak of war, but their land has not felt its hunger. Their children still have full bellies." There was no bitterness in Klaus's voice, only a weary resignation, a dawning realization that mirrored Gunther's own. Klaus, too, had started to speak less of the enemy and more of them, a subtle but significant shift in perspective. The collective, demonized foe was slowly fragmenting into a collection of individuals, a society, a culture. Gunther found himself drawn to the camp's small, makeshift library, not just for the atlas, but for the discarded American magazines. He would spend hours poring over advertisements for shiny new automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines, images of domestic bliss that felt like dispatches from an entirely different planet. His own country, he had been taught, was at the forefront of technological advancement, its engineering prowess unmatched. Yet, these glossy pages showcased a consumer society operating on a scale he could scarcely comprehend, producing luxuries that were not just for the elite, but seemingly for every household. The sheer ubiquity of these goods, even in wartime, spoke of an industrial capacity that defied the propaganda's narrative of an inefficient, racially divided society teetering on the brink. The decadent lifestyle they had been taught to scorn now appeared as a manifestation of an almost limitless productive power. The changing seasons offered another subtle, yet profound contrast. As autumn deepened, the leaves outside the barracks turned to vibrant hues of red and gold, a spectacle of natural beauty untouched by the gray pallor of war. He recalled the scarred, deforested landscapes of the Eastern Front, the blackened skeletons of trees that stood as silent sentinels to destruction. Here, nature seemed to flourish with an indifferent abundance, a stark counterpoint to the man-made desolation he had known. The air, crisp and clean, carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a homely aroma that evoked memories of a childhood that now felt impossibly distant, almost belonging to another life. One afternoon, while assisting with the camp's laundry, a small detail struck him with unexpected force. The American laundry personnel, a few older women from the nearby town, worked with an easy efficiency, their faces kind, their hands calloused from work. As one woman handed him a pile of freshly washed uniforms, her gaze lingered for a moment, not with judgment or pity, but with a fleeting, almost maternal concern. She murmured something in English he couldn't quite grasp, but the tone, gentle and unthreatening, was unmistakable. It was another one of those small human moments, like the glove, that chipped away at the edifice of his ingrained hatred. These were not the soulless industrial drones of Goebbels' rhetoric, but ordinary people, living ordinary lives, capable of ordinary kindness. He started to notice the sounds beyond the wire more acutely: the distant rumble of trains, the occasional car horn, the faint, melodic chiming of a church bell on Sunday mornings. These were the sounds of a society functioning, thriving, even celebrating, while his own world was consumed by the cacophony of sirens, explosions, and marching boots. He found himself listening to the American radio broadcasts more intently, not just for the forbidden jazz, but for the news. He understood little of the words, but the confident, steady tone of the announcers, the sheer volume of information, the lack of the hysterical urgency that characterized his own nation's wartime reports, painted a picture of a nation secure in its progress, certain of its eventual triumph. The diary became his confessional. "How could we have been so wrong?" he scrawled one night, the question almost illegible in its raw desperation. Everything we were taught, it was a lie. A magnificent, terrible lie. The weight of this realization was crushing. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by those who had fed him the lies, but by himself, for having believed so completely, so fiercely. The unwavering conviction that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow ache, a void where certainty had resided. He looked at his hands, once instruments of war, now simply hands, calloused from manual labor, but no longer grasping a rifle. The uniform, once a symbol of pride and purpose, now felt like a shroud, a constant reminder of a past he could no longer reconcile with the present. The future, once a clear path towards victory and glory, was now an impenetrable fog, shrouded in the ashes of his shattered beliefs. He was a prisoner not only of the wire fence, but of his own unraveling mind, caught between a past that was a fabrication and a present that offered no easy answers, only a bewildering, unsettling truth. The quiet hum of the barrack, the distant sounds of an alien world, seemed to mock the silence within him. A silence that was less about peace and more about the deafening roar of a world collapsing. The world outside the wire, a world he had once scorned, continued its indifferent turning. News filtering through the camp grew grim for his homeland. The radio, once a source of forbidden jazz, now carried reports of Allied advances, of cities falling, of inevitable defeat. Each broadcast, imperfectly translated or gleaned from newspaper fragments, hammered another nail into the coffin of his former certainties. The grand narrative of his nation's invincibility shattered. Gunther's diary, once for hesitant questions, now chronicled disillusionment, a silent scream against the monumental deceit that had shaped his youth. He wrote of the Halloween children, the guards' simple kindness, the abundant food, the vast, untouched landscape, small truths collectively exposing a colossal lie. When Germany's surrender finally came, it was not a dramatic roar, but a quiet, anticlimactic announcement. A hush fell over the barracks, heavy with grief, relief, and profound bewilderment. For Gunther, it was less a shock, more a confirmation. The edifice he had lived by had crumbled. Klaus, the old sergeant, simply sat. "It was all for nothing," he whispered, hoarse. "All the dying, all the hunger, for nothing." Gunther felt no anger, only a vast, aching emptiness where pride had been. The uniform he wore felt like a costume for a play long ended, its tragedy only just beginning to unfold. And so, the journey of transformation, born from the bewildering normalcy of an enemy land, reached its quiet conclusion. Gunther, no longer the fervent corporal shaped by rigid ideology, stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. The barbed wire, once a barrier, now seemed a strange shield, protecting him from a world he no longer recognized. He had arrived expecting a demon, a soulless machine. He found instead a society vibrant, complex, and capable of unsettling humanity. His conflict, no longer external, was internal. How to rebuild a life from the ashes of a shattered worldview, how to carry such profound deception. Questions echoed in his newly awakened mind, but the answers, he knew, must come from within. This story, of a young man's journey from indoctrination to disillusionment, reminds us of the profound power of lived experience to dismantle even the most entrenched ideologies. It highlights the stark contrast between the narratives we are fed and the complex realities we encounter, underscoring the enduring human capacity for connection across artificial divides. If you found this exploration of transformation and history compelling, please like this video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into untold stories.